Hello, my friend. On today's episode, I'm back with Ben Pickard, and we are talking about a classic question for gym owners, which is what should you pay your trainers? So, if you have a growing or already large team and you struggle to figure out the right model for you for how to figure out trainer pay, this is a great episode for you. We break down our best practices and benchmarks so to make this question easier for you to answer. So, if that sounds helpful, keep on listening, my friends. Let's dive in. Hello, fitness business nerds. What's up? Welcome to another episode of the Business for Unicorns podcast. Before I jump into today's episode, I do want to remind you all that we have our next round of our gym growth blast off coming up very soon, and registration is open right now. If you missed the first one, this is basically 12 weeks of you working personally with Mark Fisher to grow your monthly recurring revenue. In those 12 weeks, Mark will give you everything you need to make that happen and nothing you don't. It's a very focused program. It gets started September 23rd. There are only 15 spots left at the time of me recording this. And if you want to know more, there's more information down in the show notes. But if you want to grow your business by investing in marketing and sales systems, there's no better way to spend 12 weeks. So go check it out and enroll today. Which brings me to today's episode, which is with Mr. Benjamin Pickard. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing wonderful. How are you, sir?
Good. We're recording this after kind of a long holiday American Labor Day weekend. And so what'd you get up to this past weekend?
We went up to our cabin up north and did outdoorsy shit.
Yes.
Rode ATVs, rode side-by-sides, dirt bikes, did rainwater collection, did electrical, hung out in the forest, all the things.
Rainwater collection. We should do a whole podcast about your rainwater collection project. Because I feel like that's, someone out there has got to be wanting to collect more rainwater, and we can be their go-to podcast.
I watch a lot of YouTube videos. I know things about it now.
That's amazing. Good. I'm glad you got some time outside. Yeah, I also had a bunch of friends over, and we did a lot of outdoor stuff, which was so fun. Some hikes in the woods. Took a trip to go see a friend in a musical that was really fun. And so, yeah, good holiday weekend. I'm feeling refreshed and ready to go because our Unicorn Society retreat is coming up around the corner. So we're just, 10 days away from a fun time in Boston. Okay, well, let's dive in. Today, the topic we picked is one that was actually requested from a few Unicorn Society members. They asked us to do a podcast about this. And the question was how to determine staff pay. And I think we probably could do a much longer in-depth podcast about this, and maybe we'll someday, but we thought we'd give you a quick 15-minute kind of overview of kind of how we think about staff pay. I guess before we dive in, maybe I'll give kind of one disclaimer. I don't know if this is a disclaimer as much as just context for this, is that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to all of you. This will depend on your market, your model, how old your business is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So just know that, we're going to give you a bunch of best practices. We're going to give you a few metrics. But at the end of the day, this is something that will be a different answer for many of you. But we're going to, give you in 15 minutes as clear instructions as we can for how to make these decisions. So do you want to start, Ben, with generally speaking, how do we think about what goes into determining staff pay?
Yeah, and +1 to the disclaimer Michael gave. It's kind of a balance in the broadest of strokes, a balance of what you can afford based on your pricing and margin and all your other costs, and what does the market demand in your area.
Yeah.
And as much as we would say, if you're like, what should my gym be charging? We wouldn't just say, go look at the neighboring gym and charge $1 more. When it comes to your staff pay, this is something that the market does determine. If you're way underpriced, underpaying for your area, you're gonna have a really hard time hiring coaches. And if you're way overpaying, power to you. I support True Careers for Trainers. Your margin may suffer.
Yeah.
So those are the two places I start with.
Yeah. Well, let's start with the second one first. So when it comes to determining, what are other gyms paying trainers in the area for similar jobs? And I think today we'll probably focus really on trainers. That's what most of you are hiring. What are some tips for figuring out what that is?
Go in to Indeed and Glassdoor and just Google job postings in the area. And when I did this, I wouldn't just limit it to independently owned personal training studios because they're not always hiring. But I'd be looking at big box studios, F45, Orange Theory, all of the other franchise type ones. Because, this is kind of an appeal to authority thing here. But if you've got 1,400 locations, you've probably got a pretty good model for determining staff pay,
Yeah.
and that's going to help kind of move the needle one way or the other in your area.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a place where a lot of gym owners get hung up because they're like, well, there's almost, there's a lot of people out there where there's not a lot of folks like them in their market. They think, well, there's not a lot of other sports performance gyms or, functional fitness gyms or kettlebell studios in my area. So how to compare? But that's not actually what the assignment is. The assignment is, what are the other opportunities a trainer in your area is going to have access to? They're not just applying most likely to your kind of gym. They're going to look at all their opportunities in your area, including the F45s and the big box gyms and the Orange Theories. And so I think this is a really good place to start, is to make sure you're going on Indeed and Glassdoor or Google and in your market or in similar markets, right, to wherever you live, saying, okay, what are the standards that I'm seeing across the board here, so you can position yourself accordingly. So I think that's where you start when it comes to understanding the market. How about the other piece of this first piece, which was, how much can you afford? I mean, how do you even start to answer that question?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in broad strokes, based on BFU's Big Five benchmarks of financially fit gyms, generally speaking, your total payroll per month should not be more than 40% of your gross revenue on like the average of the last 3 months. And that excludes the owner. Even if you coach, that excludes the owner. Owner comp is a separate thing. That's to non-owner people. Now, of that 40%, depending on the size of your gym, it's going to get sliced and diced a few different ways. And it kind of depends on what a trainer role is in your gym, because some trainer roles are, in the typical one-on-one model, it's you do the training sessions, you write the programming, you do the scheduling, you do the booking, sometimes you do the billing or renewing for packages. They're going to be a little higher than that 40%. In other gyms, kind of similar to mine and MFF, the trainers mostly train and do like training adjacent tasks. They're not the ones who are doing the admin and all the other things. So they're probably going to need to be lower than that 40%, because you're going to need room. Let's say your trainers get 25%. You need that buffer between 25 and 40% to still cover all your payroll. So 40% includes everybody. If you dream of an admin, you dream of a manager, that all has to fit into that 40% bucket. So your trainers need to be less than 40%. And in a ballpark world, that would be in like the 25 to 35% range.
Yeah.
Again, it depends on the job description.
Yeah, I think it's a great point that like not all models are created equal, right? If you have a strictly one-on-one model, that trainer is often doing a lot more to maintain their book of clients, so they might need to be at the higher end of that 40% range. But if they're not, and they're like most of you listening, who are the trainers are mainly training, and they have some maybe administrative duties, then what they get paid, per hour of on the floor work has to be closer to 25-35% to make room for all the other things that go into your payroll. Because a reminder, the first thing Ben said was your total payroll, excluding owner pay, should be no more than 40%. So that means all staff pay, not just trainers, all staff pay. And as you start to grow, that will include things like benefits or any other things that you spend on your core people, all has to fit in that 40%. And that's important, because if it doesn't, you're not going to have room for the rest. You're not going to have room for for taxes, for owner pay, for all the rest of the things that keep the lights on, your overhead. All of that really requires the 60% that's not being spoken of by staff. And so, I'll add one more piece to that, which is that once you decide, let's just say that you decide you can really afford to pay your trainers, let's say 30% of your total payroll, that often scales down to the hourly level, right? That often scales down. So if the average revenue they can pull in per hour on the floor is $100, that means you can afford to pay them $30 for every hour they're on the floor. And so that you can often scale down that percentage to each hour of their pay, and it scales up to your total payroll as well. That's kind of a good way to think about it. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I've been working in percentages in my head as I explain this, but you actually want to turn that percentage into a dollar amount.
Yeah.
I don't think we actually want to recommend that you pay a percentage thing. It just gets
no.
confusing and difficult.
Yeah, 100%. All right. Well, so then there's also a conversation to be had about kind of not just what the number is, but like actually how to pay trainers, like the model, right? And so in some cases, there's some trainers who get paid kind of a flat session for every session they do, whether it's one-on-one, small group, large group. There's a flat session for for all of those flat hourly rate, I should say. And then oftentimes there's like a stipend or some extra pay for things they do off the floor. That's kind of one way that we recommend and we see that happen. The other way that we see trainers get paid is more of a per client per hour rate. This works good for small group and large group, where like depending on how many people they're serving per hour, they will make more for each person. And then they maybe also have a stipend for work they do off the floor, things like meetings, checking emails, etc. Can you just kind of walk through how each of those works, Ben, and like a little bit of pros and cons, like why do you pick one over the other?
Yeah, and it's funny that we're having this conversation because I do flat rate plus stipend, and
Yes.
MFF does tiered rate, pay per client plus stipend. So we get to have a healthy debate.
Yeah.
So some of the main pros for having a flat rate plus stipend is it's really consistent payroll for the gym. Like if a coach coaches X sessions per week, their payroll is Y dollars per month. It's really easy. It's really predictable. And the stipend, we're both in favor of a stipend, covers all the admin stuff so your trainers aren't getting taken advantage of. But it's really nice because it takes the risk off the trainers and puts it onto the gym, but means the trainers are going to have a slightly less reward. So it's really good for trainers, at least for my gym, who aren't looking, they're not purely financially motivated. I'm
Yeah.
not saying anyone's exclusively financially motivated, but it works really well for us for trainers who want to have like a consistent paycheck. They want to know what they can expect. They can
Mhm.
anticipate their schedule. They're also not really on the hook for too much of like getting clients to attend. They'll obviously help with things like people haven't been in for 7 days, aka an MIA report, and they'll have responsibilities with answering emails and stuff. But they're not really the main point of contact for that, and their pay reflects it.
Hey
Yeah.
there, Business for Unicorns podcast listeners. If you haven't had a chance yet to leave us a rating and a review on wherever platform you listen to this podcast, it would be so awesome if you take just a quick second to do that. And here's why. Number one, by leaving us a rating and review, you'll allow our podcast audience to grow so more gym owners can build a life and a gym they love. And number two, by leaving us feedback, you'll help us shape the future of the podcast so we know what you like, we know what you don't like, and we know what types of content is resonating and what else should we create for you. Thank you so much for your consideration. And now back to the show.
Reflects it.
Yeah. Well, I think those are some important distinctions, right? That when you pay a trainer a flat rate, regardless of how many people, let's just say you do small group personal training, that means they're getting the same amount for training one or two people as they would be for 5, 6, 7, 8, depending on your max, right? And that means as a gym, you are absorbing the risk because they're making the same amount no matter what, which I think you're right, Ben, can really work for gyms that have consistent attendance, consistent client levels, where you know that your utilization is consistently high. Then great. But for those of you who are really seasonal, or you're still in growth mode and you don't have consistent utilization amongst your clients, then you don't want to be paying a trainer the same amount for 6 people in a room versus one person in the room.
Especially if the market demands a higher pay rate.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I do think that in both cases, the thing that overlaps is we both are a big fan of a stipend. And I know you said this quickly. I just wanted to highlight it that the stipend is because trainers that are not paid for kind of every effort will often feel, as the language Ben you just used was, taken advantage of. Where they'll be like, hey, we used to do this MFF, and I think it was the wrong thing to do, which is we used to say, yeah, we did the same thing, that your pay on the floor includes stuff you have to do off the floor. So I'm paying you a higher rate per hour to do the training sessions, but I also expect you to check your emails and come to meetings and do continuing education. And what we learned over time, I think you learned this too, Ben, sometime we both learned the hard way, trainers are like, fuck that. Like that feels like I'm working for free. Right? That feels like, you're paying me to do this work, but then all this other stuff I'm doing for free. And we're like, no. We're paying you a higher hourly rate because you're doing the extra stuff. And so we learned that doesn't work. You really have to pay them for each separately. So the on-floor time gets a certain amount of money during their kind of quote revenue generating hours. And then when they're off the floor, all the rest of that stuff, continuing education, email checking, meeting attending, any other things you ask them to do, to participate in sales conversations, you name it, social media activity, all of those we do a stipend for. And usually it's based on a pretty low hourly rate, slightly above minimum wage. I think for a lot of folks, we recommend like something around $20 an hour. And it's because this is stuff that can happen off the floor, often at any time. And it's admin work, but it is paid separately because we want to show that is valuable. I'll just contrast that very briefly with the other option, which we've done kind of different times at MFF, is a pay per client per session, right? So in small group personal training, this works, I think, really well. It does mean more of the risk falls on the trainers, because if they are consistently not having full sessions, they make less money. If they're having consistently full sessions, they make more money. For example, if it's small group personal training, I'll just say they make $20 per person in the room, that no matter what, if they have one person, they're making above minimum wage. They have two people, they're making $40 an hour, three people, $60 an hour, right? If you do a 6-on-1 or 8-on-1 small group personal training and they can make $20 per person in the room, that's a really high hourly rate when those classes are full. And it's kind of a crap hourly rate when it's not. And some of the fluctuations might not be their fault, right? It might be that they, in the schedule, just don't have a lot of prime time sessions. So they might not be making as much through no fault of their own, just by kind of luck of the draw on the schedule. They might just have sessions that are less full. So I say all that to say that I do think a pay per client per hour model is useful in gyms that have a lot of seasonality, and in gyms that are in growth mode without consistent client numbers and utilization, because you do need to share in the ups and downs with your team, or else the gym's just always going to be eating it. And that's not a long-term recipe for success. I'm not to say that, we want to put all the burden on trainers, certainly not. But I think sharing some of it creates a lot of motivation for the right kinds of employees who really do want to work in full sessions. So there's really not a wrong answer here. I think, flat rate versus pay per client, I think can work for different gyms, different times. But I think we've made clear that, that both can be useful.
Yeah, 100%. And just to kind of maybe put a bow on this, the other piece here that just want to say with love and directness is there's no way of getting around this issue without doing some math.
Yeah.
So if you were coming into this podcast being, just give me what you should pay my trainers in Northeast United States, the answer is you're going to have to figure it out a little bit.
Yeah.
And the way you can think about this is look at the micro, like what are they getting paid for one person, two people, three people, but then zoom that out to the macro to see, okay, let's say all of our sessions are averaging 75% utilization, meaning if you have 4 people max, you have an average of 3 across all your sessions in a week. What would your trainers be making? Do that math and see what percentage of your gross revenue is that. Because if that ends up being like 37%, you're going to need to make that pay per head or flat rate a little bit lower. If it ends up being like 25%, you can afford to pay a little bit higher. So you're going to have to massage the numbers a little bit. Because back to your original point, like there isn't really a right answer. There's just a handful of ways to do it wrong. But if you go through a couple different scenarios of what could this look like in my gym, like you're going to get to an answer pretty easily, especially when you know your range is A to B because of all the research you did on Glassdoor.
Yeah, 100%.
It's your gym.
Yeah, 100%. I think, just going back, we did a benchmarking report in 2023 that gave us some kind of averages across all of our Unicorn Study members and some other folks in the industry. And so I'll just give you those numbers for what on average people are charging for each service. So on average, we saw that for personal training, people are on average charging about $80 to $83 per session. So if you use just like our base number of 30%, most of you can probably afford to spend somewhere around 30% for your payroll. That means you're paying that person like around $25 an hour for a one-on-one session. If you're charging that, if you're charging more, you can that number goes up. But if it's $80, it's about that. If for small group personal training or semi-private training, the number we saw, which was an average in 2023, was $48 per session. So 30% of that is about $15, right? That's just at minimum wage, which means you might want to have a standard that you have to have at least 2 people in your small group or your semi-private, which means that the minimum they'd make is $30 an hour for those 2 people, right? And large group we see is $27 on average for large group, and so that if you do per person is only $8, right? So again, you would need to have a minimum 3-4 people in a class if you're paying per person to be able to pay them enough to make it worth their time. But I think that just gives you a broad ballpark of where to be looking. Because I know people are like, give me some numbers. Well, those are some numbers. If you're somewhere close to those, you're probably on the right track-ish. Let's wrap it up. Anything else you want to say in closing here, Ben?
Yeah, just I get that this can be a hard thing to figure out, where it feels like a hard thing. I remember when I did this way back when, it was like a really stressful piece. And if you check your math and compare some stuff and like look at it from a couple different angles, from the business perspective if sessions are full, business perspective if
Yep.
they're half full, coach's perspective for both of those. Like you're not really going to go wrong with it.
Yeah.
Especially when you add in the stipend piece. We're both huge fans of that. I don't need to repeat everything we said.
Yeah.
But like it ends up being something where like, yeah, I'm aware the average trainer is not making $137,000 a year and is driving a Porsche to their training sessions. There are
Yep.
some of those, but that's not the norm. You can still create a really awesome career for your trainers with stable pay and consistent expectations where they're coaching 25 to 30 hours a week and making like 40 to 60 grand a year, depending on your market. So as much as there's that probably desire in you to be like, I really want to make sure my staff are taken care of, I just want to remind you that if you overpay your trainers and have to take away money and they quit, when the business goes out of business, you're actually getting the opposite effect. So start conservative and work your way up, because you can always be like, hey guys, turns out we can afford $2 an hour extra.
Yeah.
Everyone gets a raise. Like that's great news to have, rather than you got to cut your pay 10%.
Yeah. Well said, Ben. If you're new at this or just starting out, start lower, give yourself room to grow, give your people room to grow. On the same benchmarking survey, the average salary for a first year trainer was $30,000. Right? That's across many different markets. Yours might be higher or lower, but the average across people we surveyed was around $30,000. So just, keep that in mind as well. First year trainers are not incredibly well paid, but they often have the potential to keep growing throughout their career. So don't start too high or you'll have nowhere else to go. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks for a great conversation, Ben. And friends, if you want to learn more about our Gym Growth Blast-Off program, it starts again September 23rd. Only got a few spots left as of this recording. Click the link below in the show notes and come join us. Thanks, Ben. See you on the next one.
Thank you.